My name is Hannah Collins, and I need to tell you something that's been eating me alive for months now. I'm sitting here on the front porch of what used to be my home in Jacksonville Neck, Florida, watching the Spanish moss sway in the humid evening breeze, and I can barely believe what my own family did to me. But let me start from the beginning, because this story, it's complicated, and it's heartbreaking, and honestly, I'm still trying to make sense of it all myself. I was born and raised in this little wooden house on Maple Street, about 20 minutes from downtown Jacksonville. It's nothing fancy, just a small 2-bedroom cottage that my grandfather, Thomas Collins, built back in 1962 with his own 2 hands. The paint on the shutters has always been this faded blue color, and the front porch creaks when you walk across it. But to me, it was everything. It was home. My parents, Elaine and Robert Collins, moved out when I was 23. They bought a bigger place in Mandarin, one of those cookie-cutter subdivisions with perfect lawns and homeowner association rules. They said they wanted something more appropriate for their stage in life, but they kept the old house, and when they asked if I wanted to stay and take care of it, I jumped at the chance. Just temporarily, my mother said back then, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the kitchen counter, until we figure out what to do with the property. 6 years. I lived in that house for 6 years, and every single day, I poured my heart into it. I wasn't just staying there, I was transforming it, making it mine in every way that mattered. I scraped old wallpaper off the bedroom walls at midnight, my fingers raw and bleeding from the work. I spent entire weekends at Home Depot, learning about plumbing and electrical work from YouTube videos because I couldn't afford to hire professionals. The bathroom was my first big project. The old pink tiles from the 70s were cracked and stained, and the shower barely worked. I saved up for months to buy new subway tiles, classic white ones that would never go out of style, and I installed every single one myself. My back ached for weeks, but when I stepped back and saw that beautiful, clean bathroom, I cried. I actually cried because it was the first time in my life I'd created something with my own hands that I was truly proud of. Then came the kitchen. God, the kitchen was a disaster. The cabinets were dark brown wood that made the whole room feel like a cave, and the countertops were this horrible yellow laminate that had seen better days in the 80s. I spent 3 months refinishing those cabinets, stripping them down to bare wood and painting them a soft cream color. I found butcher block countertops on sale at a warehouse store and convinced my neighbor, Jake Martinez, to help me install them. Jake was this sweet older man who lived next door with his wife Carmen. They'd been watching me work on the house for years, and Jake would often come over with his toolbox when he saw me struggling with something beyond my skill level. "Mija," he'd say in his gentle voice, "you're going to hurt yourself trying to lift that by yourself. Let me help." Carmen would bring over homemade empanadas and sweet tea while we worked, and she'd always tell me how proud she was of what I was doing with the place. "Your grandfather would love seeing this," she'd say, her eyes twinkling. "Thomas always said this house had good bones. You're just helping people see them again." The living room was my masterpiece. I tore up the old brown carpet, and let me tell you, what I found underneath was not pretty. The hardwood floors were in rough shape, covered in years of scratches and water damage, but I could see the potential. I rented a floor sander and spent a long weekend bringing those floors back to life. The dust was everywhere, in my hair, my clothes, my lungs. But when I finally applied the finish and stepped back to look at those gleaming oak floors, I knew it was worth it. I painted every wall in that house. The living room became a warm, welcoming cream color that caught the morning sunlight perfectly. The bedrooms got fresh coats of soft blues and greens, colors that reminded me of the ocean just an hour's drive east. I hung pictures on those walls, pictures of family trips and friends and all the good memories I'd collected over the years. The front porch was where I spent most of my evenings. I'd painted the old wicker furniture white and added colorful cushions from Target. I planted flower boxes with petunias and marigolds that bloomed from spring through fall, attracting butterflies and hummingbirds. On warm nights, I'd sit out there with a glass of sweet tea, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood. Kids playing in yards, dogs barking, the distant hum of traffic on Phillips Highway. My parents would visit sometimes, usually on Sundays after church. My mother would walk through the house with this expression I couldn't quite read, her lips pressed together as she took in all the changes I'd made. "You've certainly made it your own," she'd say, and I could never tell if that was a compliment or criticism. My father was different. He'd run his hands along the new countertops and nod approvingly. "Good work, Hannah. You're getting quite handy with this stuff, But it was my younger brother Dylan who really bothered me during those visits. Dylan was 26, 3 years younger than me, and he'd always been the golden child. Where I was practical and hardworking, Dylan was charming and charismatic. Where I chose a career in medical administration, steady, reliable, but not particularly glamorous, Dylan went into sales and made twice what I did while working half as hard. He'd walk through my house like he was appraising it, making comments about things I should change or improve. You know, Hannah, if you knocked out this wall, you'd have much better flow between the kitchen and living room, he'd say, gesturing with his beer bottle. Or, these floors are nice, but have you considered tile instead? It's more practical in Florida's climate. I tried to brush off his comments, but they stung. This was my home, my sanctuary, and every criticism felt like a personal attack. But Dylan had always been like this, unable to let me have anything without trying to improve on it or claim he could do it better. My parents always seemed to light up when Dylan was around. My mother would fuss over him, making sure he had enough to eat and asking about his job and his girlfriend Stephanie. My father would want to hear about Dylan's latest sales numbers and would beam with pride when Dylan talked about closing big deals. Meanwhile, I felt invisible. I'd spend hours preparing Sunday dinner, setting the table with my grandmother's china, making sure everything was perfect, but the conversation always centered around Dylan, his achievements, his plans, his opinions about everything from politics to what kind of car I should buy. Hannah works so hard on this little house, my mother would say occasionally, but it always felt like an afterthought, like she was checking a box to make sure she'd acknowledged both her children. The thing is, I genuinely loved that house. It wasn't just the 4 walls and a roof. It was the life I'd built inside those walls. It was the mornings when sunlight streamed through the kitchen window while I made coffee. It was the evenings when I'd curl up on the couch, I'd reupholstered myself, reading books from the library. It was the sense of accomplishment I felt every time I looked around and saw all the work I'd done. I started thinking of it as truly mine. Not legally, of course. I knew the deed was still in my parents' names, but in every way that mattered, it was my home. I'd made it beautiful. I'd made it functional. I'd made it a reflection of who I was and what I valued. My friends would come over for dinner parties, and they'd always compliment me on how cozy and welcoming the house felt. My coworker Ashley once said, "Hannah, you should be an interior designer. You have such an eye for this stuff." That comment made my whole week. I started dating a guy named Marcus during my 4th year in the house. He was a teacher at one of the local elementary schools, and he loved coming over because he said my house felt like a real home, not like the sterile apartment he rented near the beach. "You can tell someone who cares lives here," he'd say, running his hand along the mantel where I'd displayed family photos and little treasures I'd collected over the years. Marcus and I would spend weekends working in the small backyard, planting a vegetable garden and building a little fire pit where we could sit on cool winter nights. He helped me install string lights around the back porch, and we'd spend hours out there talking about our dreams and plans for the future. I thought those plans included staying in that house forever. I thought maybe Marcus and I would get married there, maybe have kids who would play in that same backyard where I'd played as a child when visiting my grandfather. I thought I'd grow old in that house, sitting on the front porch watching grandchildren ride their bikes in the street. But life has a way of destroying your assumptions when you least expect it. It was a Tuesday evening in July when everything changed. The air was thick and humid, the way it always gets in Florida during the summer months. I'd just gotten home from work and was watering my flower boxes when my phone rang. "Hannah, honey, can you come over tonight?" It was my mother's voice, but there was something different about it, something formal and distant. "Is everything okay?" I asked, setting down the watering can. "Your father and I need to discuss something with you. Can you be here by 7? I glanced at my watch. It was already 6:15, and their house in Mandarin was at least 30 minutes away with traffic. "Can't we talk on the phone?" I was just about to start dinner. "No, Hannah, this needs to be done in person. 7 o'clock. The line went dead, and I stood there staring at my phone, a knot forming in my stomach. My parents weren't the type to be mysterious or dramatic. If they wanted to see me urgently, it had to be something serious. I threw on a clean shirt and drove across town to their subdivision, my mind racing through possibilities. Was someone sick? Were they having financial problems? Had something happened to Dylan? Their house always intimidated me a little. It was one of those big colonial-style homes with perfectly manicured lawns and professional landscaping. Everything was beige and pristine and expensive-looking. It felt like a model home, beautiful but somehow cold and impersonal. I parked in their circular driveway behind Dylan's black BMW, so he was there too. That made the knot in my stomach tighten even more. My mother answered the door wearing one of her church outfits, a navy blue dress with matching shoes and her pearl necklace. She looked like she was dressed for something important, which only added to my anxiety. "Hannah, come in." "We're in the living room." I followed her through the marble foyer into their formal living room, where my father and Dylan were already waiting. My father sat in his leather recliner, wearing khakis and a polo shirt, his reading glasses perched on his nose. Dylan was on the couch, and I noticed he was dressed up too, button-down shirt and dress pants, like he'd come straight from showing houses to clients. "Sit down, sweetheart," my mother said, gesturing to the chair across from Dylan. I sat down, my hands trembling slightly. "What's going on? You're all acting so weird." My parents exchanged a look, one of those married couple looks where they communicate without words. My father cleared his throat. "Hannah, your mother and I have been doing a lot of thinking lately about our financial situation and our future plans." "Okay," I said slowly, not sure where this was going. "The house on Maple Street," my mother continued, "has been a burden on us for years. The property taxes, the maintenance costs, the insurance. It's become more expense than it's worth." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "But I take care of all the maintenance. I pay for everything myself. You don't spend a penny on that house." "That's not entirely true," my father said. "We still pay the property taxes and insurance. And the house is getting older. Hannah, it's going to need major repairs soon. A new roof, probably new plumbing, maybe even foundation work. So, we've decided to sell it," my mother said, her voice matter of fact. The room started spinning. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to process what they'd just said. "Sell it, but I live there. That's my home." "We know this is difficult, honey," my father said. "But you're 29 years old. It's time you found your own place anyway." I looked at Dylan, hoping for some support, some indication that he thought this was as crazy as I did. But he was just sitting there with this weird expression on his face, like he was trying not to smile. "And I don't understand," I said, my voice getting higher. "I've put 6 years of my life into that house. I've invested thousands of dollars and countless hours making it beautiful. You can't just sell it out from under me." "Actually, we can," my mother said, her tone getting sharper. "It's our house, Hannah. Our name is on the deed, but you told me I could stay there. You said I was taking care of it for you. And you did a lovely job," my father said. "But circumstances change." I felt tears starting to form in my eyes, and I blinked them back furiously. I would not cry in front of them. Not about this. "How long do I have?" I asked. Another look passed between my parents. "Actually, Hannah," my mother said, "we're not selling it." I felt a surge of relief so strong it made me dizzy. "Oh, thank God. You scared me for a minute there." "So what's the problem then?" Dylan finally spoke up, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Something smug and satisfied. "They're giving it to me." The words hit me like a physical blow. "They're giving it to me." I stared at Dylan, my mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. For a moment, I couldn't process what he'd just said. It was like my brain refused to accept the information. "What do you mean, giving it to you?" I finally managed to whisper. My mother leaned forward in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Dylan is getting married next year. Hannah, he and Stephanie need a place to start their lives together. But I live there," I said, my voice breaking despite my best efforts to stay strong. "That's my home. I've spent 6 years making it perfect." "And you did a wonderful job," my father said, like he was praising a child who'd cleaned her room. "Dylan appreciates all the work you put into it. Don't you, son?" Dylan nodded, but I could see the satisfaction in his eyes. He was enjoying this. My little brother was actually enjoying watching my world collapse. "The timing worked out perfectly," Dylan said, leaning back on the couch like he was discussing the weather. "Stephanie and I were looking at starter homes, but everything in our price range needed so much work. When Mom and Dad suggested the Maple Street house, it seemed like the perfect solution." "Perfect solution," I repeated, my voice getting louder. "I'm not a problem that needs solving. I'm your daughter. I'm your sister. Hannah, please don't be dramatic," my mother said, her tone ice cold. "This is a business decision. Dylan is getting married and starting a family. You're still single. And frankly, at your age, we're not sure that's going to change." The cruelty of that statement took my breath away. I felt like she'd reached into my chest and squeezed my heart until it stopped beating. "That's not fair," I whispered. "Life isn't fair, sweetheart," my father said. "But this is what's best for the family." "What's best for the family?" I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against their hardwood floor. "Or what's best for your favorite child?" The silence that followed was deafening. My parents exchanged another one of their looks, and I realized I'd finally said out loud what we'd all been pretending wasn't true for 29 years. "Hannah Elizabeth Collins," my mother said, using my full name the way she had when I was in trouble as a child. "That is completely inappropriate." "Is it?" I turned to face Dylan. "Tell me, little brother, how long have you known about this? How long have you been planning to steal my home?" "I'm not stealing anything," Dylan said, his voice calm and reasonable. "Mom and Dad are giving me the house as a wedding gift. It's their house to give, after I've spent 6 years of my life fixing it up for you. Nobody asked you to do all that work," my mother said sharply. "You chose to make those improvements. That was your decision." I felt like I was drowning. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my place in it, was crumbling around me. These people, my parents, my brother, were sitting here calmly discussing how to take away the only thing that mattered to me, and they were acting like I was being unreasonable for being upset about it. "When?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "When what?" my father asked. "When do I have to be out?" Another silence, another look between my parents. "We were thinking the end of August," my mother said. "And that gives you about 6 weeks to find somewhere else to live. 6 weeks. 6 weeks to find a new place, pack up 6 years of my life, and somehow start over. 6 weeks to say goodbye to the home I'd created with my own hands." "What about all the money I've invested in that house?" I asked. "The renovations, the improvements, all the materials I bought?" "Consider it rent," Dylan said with a shrug. "You lived there for 6 years, basically for free. I paid utilities. I paid for maintenance. I bought groceries and cleaned and took care of everything. And we appreciate that," my father said. "But Dylan's right. You lived rent-free for 6 years. Most people your age are paying $800 and $1,000 a month for rent. You've saved a lot of money." I wanted to scream that I hadn't saved money. I'd invested every penny I had into making that house beautiful. I'd bought materials and tools and furniture. I'd skipped vacations and nights out with friends to afford the renovations. But looking at their faces, I realized it wouldn't matter what I said. They'd already made their decision, and nothing I could say would change it. "What about Marcus?" I asked desperately. "We were talking about getting engaged. We were planning a future in that house. Marcus will understand," my mother said dismissively. "And if he doesn't, then maybe he wasn't the right man for you anyway." The casual way she dismissed the relationship that meant everything to me was like another slap in the face. Marcus and I had been together for almost 2 years. We'd talked about marriage, about kids, about growing old together, and she was acting like he was just some casual boyfriend who didn't matter. "Besides," Dylan added, "Stephanie has some great ideas for updating the place. She wants to knock out the wall between the kitchen and living room, maybe add a master suite above the garage. They were going to destroy everything I'd built, all the careful thought I'd put into the layout, all the hours I'd spent choosing paint colors and fixtures. All of it was going to be ripped out and redone to suit my brother's fiancée. "You can't do this," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew how pathetic they sounded. "We can, and we are," my mother said firmly. "Hannah, you're almost 30 years old. It's time you learned to stand on your own 2 feet, instead of depending on your parents. I wasn't depending on you. I was taking care of a house you didn't want to deal with. We're grateful for everything you did," my father said in that patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. "But it's time to move on." I looked around the room at these 3 people who were supposed to love me, supposed to support me, supposed to have my back no matter what. Instead, they were systematically destroying my life and acting like they were doing me a favor. "Fine," I said, my voice shaking with rage and heartbreak. "Fine. You want me out? I'll be out. But don't expect me to just smile and pretend everything's okay. Don't expect me to come to Sunday dinners and act like we're one big happy family." "Hannah, don't be like this," my mother said, but I could hear the irritation in her voice rather than any real concern. "Don't be like what? Upset that my own family is betraying me? Hurt that you're giving my home to the golden boy without even asking how I feel about it?" "It was never your home," Dylan said quietly, but his words carried across the room like a gunshot. I stared at him, this person I'd grown up with, played with as children, protected from bullies at school. This person who was now looking at me like I was nothing more than an obstacle to his happiness. You're right, I said, my voice eerily calm now. It was never my home, because home is supposed to be where people love you and want you around. Clearly, I've been confused about what that means. I grabbed my purse and headed for the door, my parents' voices calling after me, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't bear to look at them anymore. The drive back to Maple Street, back to the house that was no longer mine, was a blur of tears and rage. I kept thinking about all the Sunday dinners I'd hosted, all the times I'd welcomed them into the space I'd created, all the pride I'd felt showing them the improvements I'd made. Had they been planning this the whole time? Had every compliment been a lie? I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a long time, looking at the house I'd loved so much. The flower boxes I'd planted were blooming beautifully. The porch furniture I'd painted, white gleamed in the streetlight. Everything looked exactly the way it had when I'd left 2 hours earlier, but somehow it all felt different now. My phone was buzzing with text messages, 3 from my mother. Hannah, please don't be like this. We can discuss this like adults. Call me when you've calmed down. 1 from Dylan. I know you're upset, but this is really for the best. And 1 from my father. Your mother is very upset. Please call and apologize. Apologize. They wanted me to apologize for being hurt, that they'd just stolen my life out from under me. I turned off my phone and went inside. The house felt different now, knowing it wasn't really mine. Every room I walked through, every improvement I'd made, every memory I'd created here, it all felt tainted now. This wasn't my sanctuary anymore. It was just a place I'd been temporarily allowed to stay, like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the couch I'd reupholstered myself, trying to figure out what I was going to do. Where was I going to live? I'd never looked for an apartment because I'd always assumed I'd stay here. I didn't know what was available, what I could afford, how long it would take to find something decent. And Marcus. God, I had to tell Marcus. We'd been talking about him moving in with me after we got engaged. We'd been planning our future around this house, around the life we were building together here. I called him, and when he heard me crying, he came right over. They did what? He said after I told him the whole story. He was pacing around my living room, running his hands through his hair. They can't just give your house away. Apparently they can, I said miserably. It's in their names. Legally, they can do whatever they want with it. Marcus sat down next to me on the couch and pulled me into his arms. Hannah, I'm so sorry. I know how much this place means to you. I don't know what I'm going to do, I whispered against his chest. I don't know where to go or how to start over. I put everything I had into this place. We'll figure it out, he said, stroking my hair. Maybe we can find a place together. Maybe this is actually a blessing in disguise. But even as he said it, I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We'd been taking our relationship slowly, and moving in together hadn't been part of our immediate plans. This was forcing his hand in a way that wasn't fair to either of us. Over the next few days, I tried to wrap my head around what was happening. I started looking at rental listings online, and the reality of Jacksonville's housing market hit me like a truck. Everything decent was expensive, and everything affordable was either in a bad neighborhood or falling apart. The money I'd saved over the years had all gone into house improvements. I had enough for a security deposit and maybe 2 months' rent, but that was it. My friends at work were sympathetic but not particularly helpful. Ashley kept saying things like, maybe it's time for a fresh start anyway, and at least you'll finally have your own place. She didn't understand that I already had my own place, or at least I thought I did. The worst part was the waiting. 6 weeks seemed like forever, and no time at all. Every morning I woke up in the house I'd created, and every morning I remembered that it was all going to be taken away from me. Dylan called a few times, wanting to discuss the transition, and asking about things like which appliances would stay with the house. All of them, apparently, since I'd bought most of them, and whether I'd be willing to leave behind some of the furniture I'd refinished. I would not. Come on, Hannah, he said during one particularly frustrating phone call. Be reasonable. Stephanie loves that dining room table you redid. Can't you just leave it as a housewarming gift? No, Dylan. I cannot just leave the dining room table I spent 3 months refinishing as a housewarming gift. That table is mine. But it fits the space so perfectly. I hung up on him. My mother called too, trying to smooth things over with her version of an apology. Hannah, I know you're hurt, but you have to understand our position. Dylan is getting married. He needs stability. And I don't. I asked. "You're different, sweetheart. You've always been so independent, so capable of taking care of yourself. Dylan needs more support." There it was, the truth I'd always suspected but never wanted to acknowledge. In my parents' eyes, Dylan was the child who needed to be taken care of, protected, given every advantage. I was the strong one, the independent one, the one who could handle anything life threw at her. Except I couldn't handle this. This was breaking me in ways I'd never experienced before. 3 weeks into my notice period, I found an apartment. It was a one-bedroom place in a complex near the beach, about 20 minutes from work. It was clean and safe, but it was generic and impersonal. White walls, beige carpet, standard apartment fixtures. It was the opposite of everything I'd created in my grandfather's house. The day I signed the lease, I sat in the rental office and cried. The property manager, a kind woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, handed me tissues and told me that sometimes change was hard, but it usually worked out for the best. I wanted to tell her that this wasn't change. This was theft. This was betrayal. This was my own family deciding that my happiness didn't matter as much as my brother's convenience. But instead, I just nodded and signed the papers and wrote a check for the security deposit, and tried to pretend that my heart wasn't completely shattered. 2 weeks before I was supposed to move out, Stephanie came to see the house. Dylan brought her over on a Sunday afternoon, and she walked through my home like she was already the owner, pointing out changes she wanted to make and problems she saw. "The kitchen is cute," she said in a tone that made it clear she thought it was anything but cute, "but we'll definitely need to update it. These cabinets are so dated." I'd spent months refinishing those cabinets. I'd sanded them by hand, primed them carefully, painted them with 3 coats of high-quality paint. They weren't dated, they were classic. "And this bathroom," she continued, wrinkling her nose at my subway tile. "It's so basic. I'm thinking maybe some natural stone, something with more personality." I wanted to scream that the bathroom had plenty of personality. My personality. Every tile had been placed by my hands. Every grout line had been carefully cleaned. The vanity had been restored from a piece I'd found at an estate sale. But I bit my tongue and watched her systematically dismiss everything I'd created. "The good news is that the bones are solid," she said to Dylan, like I wasn't even there. "Your sister did a decent job with the basic updates. We can build on that foundation." Decent job. 6 years of my life, and she called it a decent job. After they left, I sat on my front porch and looked at the street where I'd lived for so long. Mrs. Martinez waved at me from her garden, where she was deadheading her roses. "How are you holding up, mija?" she called over. I walked over to the fence that separated our yards. Carmen had been like a surrogate grandmother to me during my years on Maple Street. She'd watched me grow from a young woman who didn't know how to change a light fixture to someone who could install a ceiling fan and tile a bathroom. "I'm okay," I lied. She gave me a look that said she wasn't buying it. "You know, your grandfather used to sit on that porch every evening when I first moved here. He was so proud of that little house. I wish he was still here," I said, and my voice broke a little. "He is, mija. He's in every board of that house, every nail, every memory. No one can take that away from you. But they could take away my access to it. They could give it to someone who saw it as just a starter home to be gutted and renovated according to her own vision." That night, I sat in my bedroom, soon to be Dylan and Stephanie's bedroom, and tried to figure out how everything had gone so wrong. How had I ended up here, at 29 years old, having to start my entire life over, because my own family had decided I didn't deserve the home I'd created. And that's when I remembered something I'd almost forgotten about, tucked away in a shoebox in my closet. A letter from my grandfather, written to me when I was 23 and first moving into the house. My hands were shaking as I found the shoebox and opened it. There, underneath some old photos and birthday cards, was an envelope with my name written in my grandfather's careful handwriting. I opened it with trembling fingers, and what I found inside changed everything. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unfold the letter. It was written on my grandfather's personal stationery, cream-colored paper with his initials embossed at the top. The ink was slightly faded, but his handwriting was as clear and precise as I remembered. "My dearest Hannah, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you, and you've found yourself in some kind of trouble regarding the house on Maple Street. I hope that's not the case, but knowing your parents as I do, I suspect it might be. I want you to know something that I never told your mother and father, something I probably should have told them years ago but didn't have the courage to do. When I built that house in 1962, I built it for my family, for my children and grandchildren and the generations that would come after, but I also built it as a sanctuary, a place where someone in our family would always have a home, no matter what happened in their lives. Your grandmother and I always said that house would go to whoever needed it most, whoever would love it and care for it the way it deserved. Hannah, I've been watching you since you moved in, and I know you think this is temporary. I know your parents told you they'd figure out what to do with the property eventually, but what they don't know, what I never had the chance to tell them, is that I never left that house to them. Enclosed with this letter, you'll find a copy of my will, properly notarized and filed with the county. I also had a deed of trust prepared, naming you as the sole beneficiary of the Maple Street property. Your parents have been paying property taxes and insurance on a house they don't actually own. I know this probably comes as a shock, sweetheart. I know you're probably wondering why I never told you, why I let you think you were just staying there temporarily. The truth is, I wanted to see what you would do with the place. I wanted to see if you would love it the way your grandmother and I did. And you have, haven't you? I've driven by so many times over the years, watching you work in the yard, seeing the lights on in the evening, noticing all the little improvements you've made. That house is alive again because of you, Hannah. It's a home again because you made it one. The original deed and will are in a safety deposit box at First National Bank on Phillips Highway, box number 247. The key is taped to the back of this letter, and you're listed as the authorized user. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, but I wanted you to love that house for itself, not because it was yours by law, and I can see that you do. Take care of it, sweetheart. Take care of yourself, and don't let anyone, not even family, make you feel like you don't deserve the home you've created. All my love, Grandpa Thomas. I read the letter 3 times before the words really sank in. Then I turned it over, and sure enough, taped to the back was a small brass key. The house was mine. It had always been mine. My grandfather had left it to me 7 years ago, and my parents had been living a lie this entire time. My first emotion was relief so overwhelming I started crying again. But then came the anger, a rage so pure and intense it made me dizzy. My parents had known. They had to have known. You don't just forget about inheriting a house, and they'd been paying property taxes on it for years. They'd known it wasn't theirs to give to Dylan, and they'd tried to do it anyway. It was almost 9 o'clock at night, too late to call the bank, too late to do anything official. But I couldn't wait until morning. I needed to know for sure. I drove to First National Bank and used their ATM, just to see the building, to make this feel real. Then I sat in the parking lot and called Marcus. Hannah, what's wrong? Can you come over? Right now. I need to tell you something, and I can't do it over the phone. Of course. I'll be there in 15 minutes. When he arrived, I was still sitting on my living room floor with the letter spread out in front of me, surrounded by the other papers from the shoebox, old photos of my grandfather building the house, receipts from the original construction, and a few other documents I'd never paid much attention to before. What is all this? Marcus asked, settling down next to me on the floor. I handed him the letter without saying anything. I watched his face as he read it, watched his eyes get wider and wider. Hannah, he said when he finished, do you understand what this means? It means my parents have been lying to me my entire adult life. It means this house is yours. It means Dylan can't have it. It means your parents can't give away something that doesn't belong to them. I nodded, but I felt strangely calm now. The initial shock had worn off, and now I was thinking practically. I need to get to that safety deposit box tomorrow. I need to see the actual documents. What are you going to do when you find them? That was the question I'd been asking myself for the past hour. What was I going to do? Confront my parents? Call Dylan and tell him the wedding gift he'd been counting on was never theirs to give? Get a lawyer and make this official? I don't know, I admitted. And part of me wants to wait until Dylan and Stephanie start making renovation plans, then drop this bomb on them. Part of me wants to call them all right now and tell them exactly what I think of their little scheme. And the other part? I looked around my living room, at the walls I'd painted and the floors I'd refinished and the life I'd built in this space. The other part just wants them to leave me alone. I want to stay in my house and live my life, and not have to deal with their drama anymore. Marcus squeezed my hand. Whatever you decide to do, I'm with you. Even if it means a big ugly family fight. Even if my parents never speak to me again. Hannah, they were going to steal your house and give it to your brother. If they never speak to you again after you stop them from committing fraud, that says everything about who they are as people. I'd never thought of it as fraud, But that's exactly what it was. They were planning to transfer ownership of a property that didn't belong to them. If I hadn't found this letter, if I'd moved out like they wanted, Dylan would have been living in a house he had no legal right to occupy. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about all the times my parents had made me feel like I was imposing by living in their house, all the comments about how grateful I should be for their generosity, all the times Dylan had acted like he was doing me a favor by letting me stay in the family property. They'd made me feel like a charity case when I was actually the legal owner of the house they were taking credit for providing. The next morning, I called in sick to work and was at First National Bank when they opened at 9 o'clock. The safe deposit box clerk, a middle-aged woman named Janet, walked me through the process of accessing the box. "I haven't seen anyone for this box in years," she said as we walked to the vault. "Your grandfather was such a sweet man. He used to come in every few months, just to check on things." When she opened box 247, I found exactly what my grandfather had promised, the original deed to the Maple Street property, with my name listed as the sole beneficiary, and a copy of his will that clearly stated his intentions. There were also some other papers, insurance documents, tax records, and what looked like correspondence with a lawyer. "Can I get copies of these?" I asked Janet. "Of course, honey. Take your time." I spent an hour at the bank, copying every document in that box. The lawyer's correspondence was particularly interesting. Apparently, my grandfather had worked with an attorney named William Chen to set up the deed of trust specifically to avoid probate and ensure that the house would pass directly to me without my parents being able to interfere. The last letter in the file was from Mr. Chen to my grandfather, dated just 2 months before Grandpa died. "Mr. Collins, as we discussed, the arrangements for the Maple Street property are complete. Ms. Hannah Collins will inherit the property directly upon your death, and the deed of trust ensures that no other parties can claim ownership. I strongly recommend that you inform your son and daughter-in-law of these arrangements to avoid any confusion later, but I understand your desire to keep this private for now. My grandfather had known exactly what he was doing. He'd protected me legally, but he'd never told my parents that the house wasn't theirs. Whether that was because he was planning to tell them later and died before he had the chance, or because he suspected they might try exactly what they were trying to do now, I'd never know. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that I had legal proof that this house was mine, and no one, not my parents, not Dylan, not anyone, could take it away from me. I left the bank feeling like a completely different person than I'd been when I walked in. For the first time in weeks, I felt powerful. I felt like I had control over my own life. Now I just had to decide what to do with that power. I drove home, my house that I legally owned, and sat on the front porch where my grandfather used to sit. Mrs. Martinez was in her garden again, and she waved at me. "You look better today, mija," she called over. "I feel better," I said, and for the first time in weeks, that was completely true. My phone had been buzzing all morning with missed calls and text messages. 3 calls from my mother, 2 from Dylan, and several texts asking where I was and why I wasn't at work. I ignored them all. Instead, I called the law office of William Chen. His secretary told me he was semi-retired now but still handled estate matters for longtime clients. When I explained who I was and mentioned my grandfather's name, she put me through immediately. "Hannah Collins," Mr. Chen said warmly. "I wondered when I might hear from you. I assume you've found your grandfather's letter." "Yesterday," I said, "and I went to the bank this morning." "Mr. Chen, did my grandfather ever tell my parents about the deed of trust?" There was a pause. "Not to my knowledge, no. Thomas was very concerned about family dynamics. He felt that your parents might not understand his reasoning for leaving the property to you specifically. They're trying to give it to my brother, as a wedding gift." Another pause. Longer this time. "I see. And they told you to move out. 6 weeks' notice. I was supposed to be out by the end of August. Miss Collins, I think we need to meet in person. Are you available this afternoon?" 2 hours later, I was sitting in Mr. Chen's office in downtown Jacksonville, watching him review copies of all the documents from the safety deposit box. "Everything appears to be in order," he said finally. "The deed of trust was properly executed and recorded with the county. You are the sole legal owner of the Maple Street property, and you have been since your grandfather's death. What does that mean for my parents? They've been paying property taxes. That was generous of them, but it doesn't give them any legal claim to the property. If anything, you could reimburse them for those payments if you chose to, but you're certainly not obligated to. And my brother can't just move in." Mr. Chen smiled. Your brother would be trespassing if he moved into a house that belongs to you without your permission. Your parents cannot give him something that doesn't belong to them. So what do I do now? That depends on what you want to accomplish. If you simply want to assert your ownership and stop this transfer to your brother, I can send a letter to your parents informing them of the legal situation. That would be the cleanest approach. And if I want more than that? What do you mean? I thought about all the years of being treated like the lesser child, all the times my parents had made me feel guilty for living in what they claimed was their house, all the casual cruelty they'd shown me over the past few weeks. I mean, what if I want them to understand exactly what they've done? What if I want them to realize that they've been taking credit for generosity that wasn't theirs to claim? Mr. Chen leaned back in his chair. Ms. Collins, I've been practicing law for 35 years, and I've learned that family disputes are rarely about the property or the money. They're usually about respect and recognition and power. The question you need to ask yourself is, what outcome would actually make you feel better? I thought about that as I drove home. What would make me feel better? Having my parents grovel and apologize? Watching Dylan realize that his wedding gift had been taken away? Making them all understand how much they'd hurt me? Or would I feel better just living my life in my house, knowing that no one could take it away from me again? That evening, I was sitting on my front porch when Dylan's BMW pulled into my driveway. He got out looking frustrated and walked up to the porch steps. Hannah, what the hell is going on? You didn't go to work today, you're not answering your phone, and Mom is freaking out because she thinks you're having some kind of breakdown. I'm fine, I said calmly. Well, you're not acting fine. Look, I know this whole situation sucks for you, but you can't just disappear. We need to coordinate some things about the house. Stephanie wants to bring a contractor by next week to get some estimates. I looked at my little brother, this person who had been so eager to take away everything I'd worked for, and I felt a strange sense of peace. Dylan, I said, sit down. We need to talk. Dylan looked at me suspiciously, but sat down in the wicker chair across from me, the same chair where my mother had sat just a few weeks ago, telling me this was no longer my home. What's going on, Hannah? You're acting really weird. I reached into the folder beside my chair and pulled out the copies of the documents I'd gotten from the bank. Dylan, what do you know about Grandpa's will? What do you mean? He didn't have much to leave, just some savings that got split between Mom and Dad. What about this house? Dylan shrugged. What about it? Mom and Dad inherited it when he died. That's why they own it now. That's what they told you. That's what happened, Hannah. Why are you being so cryptic? I handed him my grandfather's letter. Read this. I watched Dylan's face change as he read. First confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked like panic. This has to be fake, he said when he finished. Mom and Dad have owned this house for 7 years. They pay the taxes. They pay the insurance. On a house that was never legally theirs, I said, and handed him the copy of the deed of trust. Dylan stared at the document like it might burst into flames. I don't understand. How is this possible? Grandpa never left this house to Mom and Dad, Dylan. He left it to me. They've been lying to both of us this whole time. But Dylan's voice trailed off as he tried to process what this meant. But they've been talking about giving me this house for months. They said it was their wedding gift to me and Stephanie. They can't give you something that doesn't belong to them. I watched my little brother's face cycle through a dozen different emotions. Confusion, anger, disappointment, and finally, something that looked like embarrassment. Did you know? He asked quietly. When we had that meeting at Mom and Dad's house, did you already know about this? No. I found the letter last night. So you've known for less than 24 hours. And you're just... what? You're going to take the house away from me. The entitled tone in his voice sparked my anger again. Dylan, I'm not taking anything away from you. This house was never yours. It was never Mom and Dad's to give you. It's been mine for 7 years, and I just found out about it. But Stephanie and I have been making plans, based on a lie. Dylan stood up and started pacing around my porch. This is insane. There has to be some mistake. Mom and Dad wouldn't lie about something this big. Wouldn't they? I asked. Think about it, Dylan. Think about how they've treated me for the past 6 years. All the comments about how grateful I should be for their generosity. All the times they made me feel like I was imposing by living in their house. They knew the truth the whole time. Maybe they just forgot. You don't forget that you don't actually own a house, Dylan. You don't accidentally pay property taxes on someone else's property for 7 years. He stopped pacing and looked at me with something I'd never seen in his eyes before. Genuine uncertainty. For the first time in his life, Dylan wasn't sure he was going to get what he wanted. "What are you going to do?" he asked. That was still the question, wasn't it? I had all the power now. I could destroy my family's plans with a single phone call to a lawyer. I could embarrass them, make them explain to everyone why the wedding gift they'd promised their son was never theirs to give. But looking at Dylan standing there on my porch, looking lost and confused, I realized something. This wasn't really his fault. He'd been lied to just as much as I had. He genuinely thought our parents owned this house and were choosing to give it to him instead of me. He thought he was the favored child getting a generous gift, not the unwitting participant in fraud. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "I'm still trying to figure that out." "Hannah." Dylan sat back down and leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Look, I know things have been weird between us lately. I know you think Mom and Dad favor me. Because they do. Maybe. But this house, Stephanie and I really need this house. Do you know how expensive it is to buy a place right now? We've been looking for months, and everything is either too expensive or falling apart or in a terrible neighborhood." I stared at him. "Are you seriously asking me to give you my house because it would be convenient for you? I'm asking you to think about what's best for the family." "The family?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Dylan, the family was ready to throw me out on the street 6 weeks ago. The family made me feel like garbage for being upset about losing my home. Where was this concern for what's best for the family when you were all planning to steal my house? We didn't know it was stealing, but it still would have been, wouldn't it? Whether you knew it or not, you would have been living in a house that didn't belong to you." Dylan was quiet for a long moment. What if we worked out some kind of arrangement? What if I paid you rent, or we set up a payment plan for me to buy it from you? Now we were getting somewhere. This was the first time since I'd found out about the inheritance that anyone in my family had acknowledged that I might have rights that deserved to be respected. "What kind of payment plan?" I asked. "I don't know. Market value? Maybe? We could get it appraised, work out monthly payments." I thought about this. The house was probably worth around $180,000 now, after all the improvements I'd made. That was a lot of money, more money than I'd ever imagined having. With that kind of money, I could buy a nicer place, maybe closer to the beach. I could start fresh somewhere new. But as I looked around at my flower boxes and my carefully painted porch furniture and the windows I'd spent hours choosing curtains for, I realized something. I didn't want to start fresh somewhere new. I wanted to stay here, in the home I'd created, in the place where I belonged. "I don't think so, Dylan. Come on, Hannah. Be reasonable." There was that word again. Reasonable. I was supposed to be reasonable while everyone else got to be selfish. "You know what would be reasonable," I said, my voice getting harder. "What would be reasonable is if Mom and Dad had told us the truth 7 years ago. What would be reasonable is if they had said, 'Hannah, Grandpa left you the house, so you don't need to worry about finding somewhere else to live.' What would be reasonable is if they hadn't spent years making me feel guilty for living in my own house. But they didn't know." "Stop saying that." I stood up abruptly. "They knew, Dylan. Maybe they didn't read the will carefully at first. Maybe they assumed they'd inherited everything. But at some point over the past 7 years, they figured out that this house wasn't theirs. And instead of telling me, they decided to keep up the lie." Dylan looked miserable, and part of me felt bad for him. But a bigger part of me was tired of protecting my family's feelings while they trampled all over mine. "I need to call Mom and Dad," he said. "You do that." He stood up and walked toward his car, then turned back. "Hannah, whatever you're planning to do, can you at least give us some warning? Stephanie has already started planning the renovation. She's gotten quotes from contractors. The fact that his fiancé was already planning to gut my house, the house I now knew was legally mine, made my decision for me. Tell Stephanie she should probably cancel those appointments," I said. After Dylan left, I sat on my porch for a long time, thinking about what I wanted to do next. The sun was setting, casting everything in that golden light that I loved so much about summer evenings in Florida. Mrs. Martinez came out to water her plants and waved at me. "Everything okay over there, mija?" she called. Actually, Mrs. Martinez, everything's perfect. And for the first time in weeks, that was true. I went inside and called Marcus. "Can you come over? I want to tell you what happened with Dylan." "Of course. But Hannah, you sound different. You sound happy." "I am happy. For the first time in a long time, I'm really happy." When Marcus arrived, I told him about the conversation with Dylan, about his request to buy the house from me, about Stephanie's renovation plans. "And you said no?" he asked. I said no. Marcus grinned and pulled me into a hug. Good for you. This is your house, Hannah. You shouldn't have to sell it to your brother just because it would be convenient for him. But now I have to deal with my parents. Dylan's probably over there right now, showing them the documents, trying to figure out how this happened. Are you worried about that? I thought about it. Was I worried? A few weeks ago, the thought of my parents being angry with me would have terrified me. I'd spent my whole life trying to earn their approval, trying to be the good daughter who didn't cause problems. But sitting here in my living room, surrounded by all the things I'd created and chosen and loved, I realized I wasn't worried at all. No, I said. I'm not worried. Let them be angry. Let them try to explain why they thought they could give away a house that didn't belong to them. My phone started ringing at 8 o'clock. First, my mother, then my father, then my mother again. I let them all go to voicemail. At 9 o'clock, there was a knock on my door. I looked through the window and saw all three of them, both my parents and Dylan, standing on my front porch. Hannah, open the door, my mother called. We need to discuss this situation. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. There's nothing to discuss, I said calmly. The house is mine. It's always been mine. You can't give Dylan something that doesn't belong to you. Hannah, please, my father said. Let's sit down and talk about this like adults. Like adults? I repeated. Adults tell the truth, Dad. Adults don't lie to their children for 7 years about who owns what. We didn't lie, my mother said sharply. We didn't realize. When did you figure it out? I asked. Silence. When did you realize that Grandpa had left the house to me and not to you? More silence. Was it when you started getting tax bills for a property that wasn't on the probate inventory? Was it when your insurance company asked for proof of ownership? When was it, Mom? My mother's face was flushed red, the way it always got when she was caught in something she couldn't explain away. It doesn't matter when we found out, she said finally. What matters is that Dylan needs this house, and you don't. I don't need my own house. You're single, Hannah. You don't need a whole house to yourself. Dylan is getting married, starting a family. So single people don't deserve to own property. Single people should just give up their homes to married couples who find it convenient. That's not what I said. It's exactly what you said. I looked at all three of them standing there on my porch, on my property that they'd been trying to steal, and I felt a calm certainty settle over me. Here's what's going to happen, I said. You're all going to leave. You're not going to call me, text me, or show up here again unless I invite you. Dylan, you and Stephanie are going to find somewhere else to live, and all of you are going to stop pretending that you're the victims in this situation. Hannah, please, Dylan said. Can't we work something out? Can't we find some kind of compromise? The compromise, I said, is that I'm not calling a lawyer to sue you for fraud. The compromise is that I'm not demanding you pay me back for 7 years of property taxes and insurance on my house. The compromise is that I'm willing to forget this ever happened if you all just leave me alone. I started to close the door, then stopped. Oh, and one more thing. Don't ever make me feel guilty for living in my own house again. I closed the door and locked it, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt like I could breathe. Outside, I could hear them talking in urgent, hushed voices. I heard my mother say something about ungrateful, and my father mention something about family loyalty. I heard Dylan's car start up and drive away, followed by my parents' car, and then it was quiet. I walked through my house, turning on the lights I'd chosen and looking at the walls I'd painted and the floors I'd refinished. Tomorrow, I would call Mr. Chen and have him send an official letter to my parents, just to make everything crystal clear from a legal standpoint. I would change the locks, just in case they'd kept copies of the keys. I would call the property tax office and make sure they had my correct contact information. But tonight, I just wanted to sit in my living room and appreciate the fact that I was home, really, truly home, and no one could take that away from me ever again. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my couch, and for the first time in weeks, I felt completely at peace. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. How did it go? I typed back. It went perfectly. Come over tomorrow and I'll tell you everything. But Marcus, we're home. We're really, finally home. 3 months later, I was sitting on my front porch on a crisp October morning, watching the leaves on the oak tree in my yard turn golden. The air had finally cooled down from the brutal Florida summer, and there was something magical about this time of year. The way the light slanted differently through the trees, the way the humidity finally broke, making it pleasant to sit outside with a cup of coffee and just breathe, So much had changed since that night when I'd stood up to my family. Mr. Chen had sent the official letter to my parents, formally notifying them that I was the legal owner of the property and that any attempt to transfer ownership to Dylan would constitute fraud. I never got a response to that letter, but I didn't expect one. I had changed the locks the very next day. It felt symbolic somehow, like I was finally taking complete control of my own space. Marcus had helped me, and we'd made it into a little celebration, picking out new hardware, installing deadbolts, making the house truly and completely mine. The silence from my family had been complete. No calls, no texts, no surprise visits. At first, I'd waited for them to reach out, maybe to apologize or at least to acknowledge what had happened. But as the weeks passed, I realized that silence was exactly what I needed. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't walking on eggshells, wasn't worrying about disappointing them or failing to live up to their expectations. I'd heard through the grapevine, specifically through my co-worker Ashley, whose cousin worked with Stephanie, that Dylan and his fiancée had found a condo in Ponte Vedra Beach. It was smaller than what they'd originally wanted and much more expensive, but apparently Stephanie had decided that beachfront living was more important than having a whole house anyway. Ashley had relayed this information with raised eyebrows, clearly expecting me to feel guilty about forcing them into a more expensive living situation. Instead, I'd felt nothing but relief. They'd figured it out, just like adults do when they can't have something that was never theirs in the first place. The biggest change, though, was in how I felt about myself and my place in the world. For years, I'd defined myself in relation to my family's approval or disapproval. I was the responsible daughter, the helpful sister, the one who could always be counted on to accommodate everyone else's needs. But living in my house, really living in it, knowing it was mine beyond any doubt, had shown me who I was when I wasn't trying to please anyone else. I was someone who woke up early on Saturday mornings to work in the garden, who spent Sunday afternoons reading on the front porch, who invited friends over for dinner parties where we laughed too loud and stayed up too late. I was someone who painted accent walls on a whim and hung art that made me happy, even if it didn't match the rest of the room perfectly. I was someone who belonged somewhere, who had roots, who had created something beautiful and lasting. Marcus and I had gotten engaged in September. He'd proposed right here on this front porch, on a warm evening when the air smelled like jasmine from Mrs. Martinez's garden next door. There had been no grand gestures or elaborate planning, just the two of us sitting in the wicker chairs, talking about our future, when he'd gotten down on one knee and asked if I'd like to build that future together in this house that I'd made our home. "Are you sure you want to marry someone whose family situation is so complicated?" I'd asked him after I'd said yes, and we were sitting there admiring the ring on my finger. "Hannah," he'd said, taking my hands in his, "your family situation isn't complicated. It's simple. You have a family that failed to appreciate you, and now you have a new family that will, starting with me." The wedding was going to be small, just close friends and the few relatives who had reached out to congratulate me when word got around about my engagement. Mrs. Martinez and her husband Jake had volunteered to help with the ceremony preparations, and we were planning to have it right here in the backyard, under the oak tree where Marcus had strung lights last Christmas. I'd thought about inviting my parents and Dylan, had even drafted the invitations with their names on them, but every time I tried to write a note to include with the invitation, something about how I hoped we could put the past behind us, the words felt hollow and false. The truth was, I didn't want them there. I didn't want to spend my wedding day walking on eggshells, trying to manage their emotions and make sure they were comfortable. This was my day, in my house, with people who actually supported my happiness. And for the first time in my life, I was choosing my own peace over their potential disappointment. I'd kept in touch with Mr. Chen, partly for legal reasons, but mostly because he'd become an unexpected source of wisdom during this whole process. When I'd told him about my decision not to invite my family to the wedding, he'd nodded approvingly. "Hannah," he'd said, "your grandfather would be proud of you. He always said that house needed someone who would fight for it, someone who wouldn't let other people make them feel small. You're exactly the person he hoped you'd become." That conversation had made me cry, but they were good tears. Tears of gratitude for a grandfather who'd loved me enough to give me not just a house, but the opportunity to discover my own strength. Work had gotten better too. Without the constant stress of wondering when I'd be forced to move, when my family would drop the next bombshell on my life, I'd found myself more focused and confident. I'd even applied for a promotion to department supervisor. something I never would have considered when I was spending all my emotional energy trying to manage my family relationships. Ashley had been supportive through the whole situation, though I could tell she didn't entirely understand my decision to cut contact with my parents. "Don't you miss them?" she'd asked one day over lunch. I'd thought about that question for a long time. Did I miss them? I missed the idea of having parents who were proud of me, who supported my choices, who wanted to be part of my life in a healthy way. But the actual people my parents had proven themselves to be, people who would lie to me for years, who would try to steal my inheritance, who would make me feel guilty for standing up for myself. No, I didn't miss them at all. I miss who I thought they were, I'd told Ashley, but I don't miss who they actually turned out to be. The house itself had continued to evolve. Without the pressure of potentially losing it, I'd felt free to make bigger changes, more permanent improvements. Marcus and I had knocked out a small wall between the kitchen and dining area, the same wall that Dylan had once suggested removing, though I tried not to think about that irony too much. We'd updated the master bathroom with a beautiful clawfoot tub that I'd found at an estate sale. We'd built raised beds in the backyard for a bigger vegetable garden, and we were planning to add a deck off the back of the house next spring. Every change we made felt like a celebration of permanence, of belonging, of finally being able to invest in a future that no one could take away from me. Mrs. Martinez had become like a surrogate grandmother through all of this. She'd been the one constant neighbor who'd watched me transform from a confused young woman who didn't know how to install a garbage disposal into someone who could plan and execute major home renovations. When I'd told her about discovering my grandfather's letter, she'd hugged me and cried. "I knew there was something special about you living in that house," she'd said. "And Thomas used to sit on that porch and talk about how he hoped someday it would go to the right person, someone who would love it the way he did. He was waiting for you, Mija. He was waiting for you to find your way to it." The night before Marcus and I got engaged, I'd had a dream about my grandfather. In the dream, he was sitting in his favorite chair on the front porch, the same chair where I now sat every morning with my coffee. He looked exactly the way I remembered him from childhood. Work clothes, kind eyes, hands that were weathered from a lifetime of building and fixing things. "You did good, sweetheart," he'd said in the dream. "You made it a home again." When I'd woken up, I'd felt such a profound sense of peace, like he really had been there, like he really was proud of what I'd done with his gift. This morning, as I sat watching the sunrise paint the sky pink and orange above my neighborhood, I thought about that dream. I thought about the scared, confused woman I'd been just a few months ago, someone who didn't know where she belonged or whether she deserved to take up space in the world. Now I knew. I belonged here, in this house that my grandfather had built, and that I had made beautiful. I deserved to be here, to be loved, to be respected, to make my own choices without having to justify them to people who didn't have my best interests at heart. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Good morning, beautiful. Looking forward to coming home to you tonight." Home. He called it home now too, and somehow that made it even more precious. We were building something together here, something that had deep roots and strong foundations, and a future that stretched out ahead of us like a promise. I texted him back, "Home will be waiting for you. Love you." As I sat there finishing my coffee, I heard a car door slam in the driveway next door. Mrs. Martinez was leaving for her morning walk, something she'd been doing every day for the 15 years I'd known her. "Morning, Hannah," she called over. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "It really is," I called back, and I meant it. After she left, I went inside and walked through my house, the same ritual I'd been doing every morning since the night I'd stood up to my family. I walked through the living room with its refinished hardwood floors, and the couch I'd reupholstered myself. I walked through the kitchen with its cream-colored cabinets and butcher block countertops. I walked through the bedrooms with their carefully chosen paint colors, and the bathroom with its subway tile that Stephanie had called basic. Every room told the story of who I was, what I valued, what I'd worked for. Every room was proof that I was capable of creating something beautiful and lasting, that I deserved good things, that I had every right to protect what was mine. In the master bedroom, I stopped in front of the mirror on my dresser. The woman looking back at me was different from the one who'd sat in her parents' living room 3 months ago, listening to them explain why her life didn't matter as much as her brother's convenience. This woman looked stronger, more sure of herself, happier. This woman looked like she belonged exactly where she was. I got dressed for work, kissed Marcus goodbye when he emerged from the shower, and grabbed my keys from the hook by the front door. As I locked up behind me, with my own keys, with my own locks, I looked back at the house one more time. The morning light was hitting the front windows just right, making them sparkle. The flower boxes were still blooming with the fall mums I'd planted last month. The porch furniture gleamed white and welcoming in the sunshine. It was beautiful. It was home. It was mine. And no one, not my parents, not my brother, not anyone, could ever take it away from me again. I walked to my car with a lightness in my step that I hadn't felt in years. Today was going to be a good day, in a good life, in the home I'd created for myself through my own hard work and love. My grandfather had given me more than just a house. He'd given me the foundation to build the life I deserved. And finally, I was living it. As I backed out of the driveway, I could see Mrs. Martinez returning from her walk, waving at me from her front yard. I waved back, thinking about how lucky I was to be surrounded by people who actually cared about my happiness. The future stretched out ahead of me, full of possibilities I was only just beginning to imagine. Marriage to a man who loved me exactly as I was. Maybe children someday, who would play in the same backyard where I'd learned to garden. Holidays and celebrations and ordinary Tuesday nights, all of them happening in the place where I belonged. I drove toward work with the windows down and the radio playing, and for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't worried about what tomorrow might bring. I was home. I was loved. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.